You're listening to The Inspire Me Show with hostess Layla Ashley, hypnotherapist, life coach, author, and speaker. The Inspire Me Show is dedicated to bringing passion and inspiration into your life and your relationships. While side effects of listening to this show may include greater feelings of love, joy, and creative inspiration, please note that this show is meant to entertain and inform and is not a replacement for professional help. Learn more at www.laylaashley.com. And now, right here on KPFK, in the spirit of love, empowerment, and freedom, your hostess, Layla Ashley.
Welcome to the Inspire Me Show, everyone. Today I have Thomas Moore on the line. Thomas Moore is a leading lecturer and writer in North America and Europe in the areas of archetypal psychology, mythology, and the imagination. He's the author of the best-selling book, Care of the Soul, and 15 other books on deepening spirituality and cultivating soul in every aspect of life. He has been a monk, a musician, a university professor, and a psychotherapist. And today he lectures widely on holistic medicine, spirituality, psychotherapy, and the arts. He lived as a monk in a Catholic religious order for 12 years and has degrees in theology, musicology, and philosophy, including a PhD in religion from Syracuse University. He has won several awards for his work, including an honorary doctorate from Lesley University and the Humanitarian Award from Einstein Medical School of Yeshiva University. 3 of his books have won the prestigious Books for a Better Life awards. He writes fiction and music and often works with his wife, artist, and yoga instructor, Hari Kiran. He writes regular columns for Resurgence, Spirituality and Health, and has recently published Writing in the Sand, The Spirituality of Jesus and the Soul of the Gospels, Care of the Soul in Medicine, and The Guru of Golf and Other Stories about the Game of Life. Much of his recent work has focused on the world of medicine, speaking to nurses and doctors about the soul and spirit of medical practice. Welcome, Tom. I am delighted to have you here on my show.
Thank you. Very happy to be with you.
Great. So let's get right into the soul. I would like to begin with some questions from your earlier foundational works, which have always been something I've been drawn to. So first, the imagination. Many people believe they have to try really hard to change, or that it requires major efforts. How can just slight shifts in imagination create momentous change?
Well, I think all of us live stories. We live a various narratives, and actually, it's probably better to say that these stories live through us. They kind of use us, and I don't think most of the time we know what stories we're in. It might be partly made up of our family life, and partly our culture and our experiences and things we're trying to work through. What I'm saying there is that we are in the imagination anyway. I mean, when you look at the world around you and you do certain things, do anything, you do them because you've got a story behind it that's usually pretty old. So if you want to change because that story might be harmful or hurting you in some way, then the thing to do is to shift in the way you look at things. First of all, you have to look at the story that you've been living and then consider alternatives. That's what I mean by a slight shift in imagination. It's actually quite momentous, but at the same time, it's often very small shift in the way you see things.
Right. It's almost like shifting the sails on a boat. It seems to only slightly shift, but when you get to your destination, you realize it's a much different place you would have been.
That's a very good analogy. Yeah, I haven't thought of that. It's true that you start at one place and you make this change, and then, it's true. When you get on, when years go by, you realize that those turning points have really been much more significant than they may have seemed at the time.
So true. So regarding change, this is a day and age where, quote, becoming conscious is really highly emphasized to bring everything into awareness. But it's not all within our conscious mind or conscious control. And you really honor the depth and the mystery of the darker sides of human experience. So can you discuss the idea that change is occurring outside of our conscious awareness, and that the alchemy of change involves also the shadow aspects?
Well, yes, we. I don't think we know much about ourselves, really. We know a lot, but we don't know. We don't know how big we are, how vast we are, how much is going on in us that we don't know about. And so, what I do in my work, I try to give a lot of space for the mystery of what it is to be a person. I use that word mystery quite a lot. Mm-hmm. I don't think we give it enough time and attention. The world we live in wants to explain everything. Mm-hmm. I mean, I say that, it may seem like an exaggeration, but I've had people tell me that very professional people say they don't like some of the things I write because I don't understand that eventually we're going to know everything. And I think to myself, well, I guess we are different then, because I think it's important to acknowledge the mysterious, the unknown, and even in our ordinary lives. Now, part of that unknown is it's unknown. It's not part of our waking life because it may be objectionable to us in some way. That's what I mean by shadow. Mm-hmm. So there may be things that we want to do. Like, for example, if sometimes some people, not everybody, but some people might not like to admit that a big purpose of their life is to make money. That may be full of shadow to them. Money has a lot of shadow, generally, anyway.
True.
So that would be one example of how a person might be motivated by trying to make some money, but on the surface of life they may be trying to live just the opposite because they don't think it's right to be so concerned about money. I'm not thinking of any particular answer to that. People have different ideas about money. And so that shadow element is there, and it's doing its work. And for a lot of people to be able to contact and know what their shadow element is liberating. Like the person who's been denying that they really want some money, maybe if they finally admitted to it and saw that that's important to them, and it doesn't have to turn out to be so bad, they may feel freer to go into life and live a happier life. So this element of shadow is important because it's liberating. And I don't think that you then become, it's not like you don't become that shadow literally. You don't suddenly become a money-hungry person. It's just that you get some of the qualities that were there in that shadow element. So it's a very important part of becoming a full person, of realizing all those different elements that make you up.
Right. Yeah, you're right. There's so much shame behind some of these things that we're conditioned to feel. And sometimes if we just let go of that shame, it releases all the tension around it, and then it's not so scary or uncomfortable to face the unknown and to just sit with the unknown.
Well, letting the shame go is not so easy, though. It's not easy. I think it has to be embraced, and you can't just, it doesn't go away. I think what you do is you become a person who acknowledges your own shadow side, and you can speak for it, and you can let people see it. Mm-hmm. Maybe not the whole thing, because that's asking way too much, but certain elements, a certain degree of that shadow could be owned and revealed and shown, manifested, and that I think is liberating. In all of these things, you can't speak too about perfection, about doing it just right. I think the imperfect solutions are pretty good.
I love that. I love it and I don't.
I know. I don't like it either.
Yeah, so what you're saying is to embrace the shame. The thing is, the shadow is still going to be the shadow. We can't transform it and call it light suddenly, or it's not the same.
No.
Yeah.
No, it's still going to be maybe a struggle, or there'll be some tension between these things, and that's okay as long as you can make some headway in, first of all, seeing what it is, and then acknowledging it, and then acting on it to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, finding a place for it in your life that works.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
That doesn't violate others, of course.
Yes, well, that's true. I think that's a very important point, that the idea is to take these things into your life, the things that have been unknown and maybe rejected, and you don't have to do it perfectly, but it has to fit your other values. That's how I sometimes put it when I think about that. You don't want something, you can't make something part of your life that's going to be objectionable totally to everything else you believe in. You have to work it out somehow and reimagine it, to see it differently, and maybe to examine it in such a way that you don't have your old attitudes anymore, but you're able to appreciate something that before you thought was worthless.
Right. And a thought comes to my mind that people often resist the shadow elements of themselves because they don't want to think that we need to suffer to find depth. How does one honor the pain and suffering of life without glorifying it or indulging in it?
I think I run into that problem in my writing sometimes and in my speaking, because I talk so much about how important it is to struggle and go through initiations and things like that are not exactly pleasant. And after a while, people feel, well, I don't want anything to do with this. It sounds too difficult. I don't really think that's true. I tend to emphasize it because it's not spoken of very much. I'm actually somebody who appreciates the positive, joyous side of life all the time, and I think that's also the other half, the other side, the other way of getting a soul in your life, being a more soulful person. You can do that by, in so many ways, by enjoying the pleasures of life. Good food and being out in nature and being with your family or friends. All of that is really positive and good, and it does contribute immensely and in a major way to a soulful life. But at the same time, you are experiencing all that good stuff, you also have to face the darker material that you're talking about.
True, which sometimes comes up when we least expect it or least want it.
It may be a sickness, it may be a lost relationship or a struggle with someone you're close to. There's so many things that happen to us, and everybody has to deal with something like that. So I think what I like to do is to start by realizing that this is part of life. And it doesn't mean that the whole of your life is now in some deep depressive struggle. It just means that a portion is. And I think that's an important point of view to have.
Definitely. Another thing is people often equate melancholy with depression or despair, but you talk fondly of that quite a bit. So how is melancholy a good thing?
Well, melancholy is different from depression. Depression is really takes everything out of your life, and it feels like a sickness, and it's so dark, and we use the word so much to cover everything. Melancholy is different. Melancholy is a certain sad state that you might be in, and usually with melancholy, you may understand why you're feeling melancholy, or you may just be a melancholic kind of person. That idea that some people have this melancholic nature is very old. I've explored at great length the descriptions of melancholy from 1,500 years ago. So it's an old idea that people are just naturally melancholic sometimes, and some people are more chronically melancholy, and that's okay. So it's not like a crisis. Sometimes when people get really depressed, it's really a crisis because they get suicidal thoughts or they just can't go about their work anymore. But melancholy is different. It's like a coloring of your mood, and you can have other moods around it, and you can also continue with your life, and it's probably easier to acknowledge to yourself and others that you have this that you're sad. And I think it's really good to use these simple words we have that are more specific for our emotions. So to say I'm sad, or I feel lost, or life is too difficult now, all of those descriptions are very specific, much better than saying I'm depressed.
Right. You also discuss melancholy as kind of a way to experience soul or to access the soul. Can you say more about that?
Well, yes, this also is a very old idea. I found it first in medieval literature, that idea that melancholy has gifts. It has something to offer us.
Mm-hmm.
And the tradition is, that, again, it goes back 1,000 years anyway, is that artists tend to be melancholy, and that, in fact, there's a close relationship between those two things. So melancholy can move the imagination and can inspire you to be creative. So it's not to say that it's a good thing and you want to go after sadness, you want to be sad, not that. But if you have a kind of approach to life that feels the pain around you and acknowledges the sadness, that kind of melancholy naturally leads to having an artistic temperament.
Yeah, that makes sense. So people look all over the place for sacredness, it seems, and usually they're looking beyond what they already have. But you really emphasize, and even wrote books about, the sacredness of everyday life, finding it where you already are. So can you kind of go into that a little bit?
Yes, that's also, an idea that's in the tradition. Many great writers have written about it. The one that influences me a lot about this idea is Henry David Thoreau, who didn't care much about going to church, but felt that his whole life was sacred, and everything he did, and his travels through nature, and even just building his cabin, and he said himself, getting up in the morning and taking a bath were sacraments for him. They were sacred actions. I've I've read those things years ago, and I thought, wow, that's really true, and it also applies in a big general way to all of us. That what if we didn't divide our worldly life from our spiritual lives? What if we didn't make put up walls between those two things, or consider them so different from each other that they have no relationship to each other? And so that really set me off on this idea that's really had got a hold of me for years and years, that there must be ways in which we can make the world sacred again. Now, it's difficult because that can be done in a sentimental way. It can be done in a way that's pretty superficial. So that's why I like to look back to other people of the past who have tried to do this, because often they have a seriousness about it. They don't do it in a silly way or a superficial way. And I think Thoreau was very, very serious. If you read Walden, his book Walden, you know how serious he was. He was a melancholic person who loved life and enjoyed life, but he was also melancholic. And he saw the sacred in nature, especially. I don't think that you have to just look at nature, though, the natural world. Cities have a certain sacredness, holiness to them. I often suggest that people take a walk in the city and just see the vitality and that's there, and everything going on, the people and how they're living. There's a sacredness. Keeping the sacred away from ordinary life, I think, makes ordinary life too material, too physical, and too limited to satisfy us.
Yeah, it's kind of like we never have enough. We keep wanting more and more and think that adding more is going to add more value, when what you're saying is to bring things back to simplicity, that doing that can really ground you into something more sacred.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, it's an excellent point. That's how I feel about it. That you don't have to bring more into life, but if you could see the depth and the absolute value, which is a way of describing the sacred, if you could see that throughout life, in every aspect of life, you wouldn't need so much stuff. All that piling up things and possessions and being so worried about piling up your money, that sort of stands in. It means it's an indication that you haven't found the inherent value in the things of life.
I would totally agree. That's a really good point. And you were a monk for about 12 years. Can you speak to that somewhat, like what you learned there? Because you, in a sense, removed yourself from the world and got a sense of what that was like.
Yes, I was in a monastic life for 12 or almost 13 years. And I value that time so much, and everything I do today, all the writing I do and my way of life, everything about it goes back to that experience. I've never felt that when I left it, I left that way of life entirely. I left that particular version of it. But there was lots of time for retreat and a lot of meditation every day, a lot of ritual, a lot of learning and study. And I do all those things now. It's like, it really isn't too different. And I really try to create a contemplative environment for myself and for my family. And I include a chapter in this book, one of the recent books of mine, A Religion of One's Own, a chapter on what we can learn from monastic life and how we could apply it today for our benefit.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I think it's really important what you said about taking what you had there and integrating it in your life. It's not that different, because that's really what we need to do, especially if we live in a big city like LA, for example. I find that I have to do a lot of that to just counterbalance some of the craziness and fast-paced life. So I think that's really encouraging and inspiring that you do that yourself and encourage other people to do that.
I do. One of the things I learned as a monk, we used to, we used a lot of Latin words because we were all studying. I was studying in Latin for years. I studied philosophy in Latin, read the books, and even did oral exams in Latin.
Wow.
So we used to have a phrase, contemptus mundi, which described what the monk does. Mundi means the world, and contemptus sounds like contempt, but it really doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean having contempt for the world. It means resisting the world, not surrendering yourself to it, finding some distance between you and the world around you. I think that's really important and necessary today, because the culture we have created, not people are great, but the culture we have created is quite neurotic and doesn't have much soul in it at all. And I'm not saying people don't. People do have a lot of soul everywhere, but the culture doesn't. And so we have to resist that culture. We can't be eaten up by it and drawn into it and unconsciously participate in it. We have to resist it every day. And you can resist in small ways. You just don't participate, or you live differently, or you make a point not to accept the values just because they're popular, or that's what people are talking about. I find in my own work, I've been talking about soul now for so many years, that I find quite a bit of resistance to me from the world, because I don't agree with most things that are going on culturally.
Mm-hmm.
So many things that I think are heartless and soulless. I think the world we're creating is hurting people in so many ways, having to work too hard, having to go to school too much. The kind of schools we have are not really very humane. They're not really adapted to children. There's so many things we do that hurt us. Things that we value on the surface and think are so great. So I speak against them, and I come up with ideas that are quite different from the world around me. That's my contemptus mundi. That's my resisting the world.
Mm-hmm. And it's truly counterculture. I was just reading one of your works the other day and had that exact thought. People throw around the term counterculture. This is truly counterculture.
Right.
If I've seen it. And the thing is, we need these messages, but that's why people resist, because they're in need of them, but they're not ready to accept them, possibly,
Yes, well, that's right. I think when someone comes along and says something different and implicitly criticizes what's going on in the culture, which is what I do. I'm not a rebel, I don't go around trying to stir up people and move against the culture. I don't do it that way. I try to present an alternative that implies a criticism, I guess. And so people hear it, and it's not what they're used to hearing, and they don't know what to think.
Right. So the soul's impulse versus our conditioning, how do we find the difference between those two?
We are all in narratives, and I have been emphasizing early narratives like childhood or family narratives that we're in. And so I guess that is a kind of conditioning. It's like what you have got used to, and you develop patterns out of it. But your pattern might be inhibiting and might be something that makes it difficult for you to love someone. And the soul, it can be kind of hidden or shackled, bound by that kind of thing, and needs to be liberated. I'm certainly not saying that every person, no matter how crazy they are, is soulful. No, it's full of soul. I don't think so. Just the opposite. We have a lot to do. There's that phrase from Keats, soul making, that we are in the process of making soul all the time, or not. And so the conditioning might be an obstacle. Habits and patterns that we're in could be obstacles. Well, this is what we do, in therapy. We try to bring those out. In fact, they're hard to see, difficult to see, and you don't get them very well from the stories people tell. So that's why in my work, I think I see those patterns in dream life, in the night dreams. So I devote almost all my time as a therapist to dream. And I see those, what I think are the patterns that people are caught up in. And by seeing them in the dreams and going down deep into that world regularly, people develop a different point of view, and they begin to see things, and their life changes. They can be more capable of a relationship then.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. That's a fantastic point. So I guess, people want to be whole. They want a sense of integrity to themselves, but it's more of an undefined kind of messy process. How can people be both attached and separate at the same time? Hold these dichotomies, whether it be in a relationship or just one's relationship to life.
One thing I always say is that human beings can do more than one thing at a time. And what you can do is you can live your own life and you can live with another person at the same time. There are moments when you're living more by yourself and maybe making choices for yourself and feeling your own self. That's very important, to feel yourself in a relationship, not having melded into it. Again, my friend Hillman used to say the worst kind of relationships are fusions, where people fuse into each other. And that's a big problem, but that doesn't mean you can't be connected in a very, very deep and intimate way and yet remain yourself and also appreciate that the other person is separate from you and has their own life to live. I think you do this on a daily basis, and you do a lot of things in common and you do a lot of things by yourself, or you make some life decisions, or you live your own life, but also you live life with another person. And I think most of the time, actually, if you have a decent relationship, the other person actually contributes to your being yourself and offers you reflection. If you're talking to each other in any significant way, offers you a lot of reflection on who you are, and that helps your own individuality. So what I'm saying there is that the connection between two people can actually foster their individuality. If it's done in a mature enough way, if it's ripe, if people are ripe for it, that can work that way.
That's really remarkable. Yeah. And I have a quote from your book, Soulmates, that I really love. A psychological symptom always points in the direction of both what the soul needs and what we are defending against. So it's kind of like, again, that both are there.
That is a principle that I learned mainly from Patricia Berry, another Jungian analyst who was very close to James Hellman. And it's one of my foundational. I have like few things I could write on my wall. Principles of the work that I do as a therapist, especially. And one of them is, and I do it in my writing too. One of them is to understand that when people are doing things that are a little bit neurotic or quite neurotic, that they're reaching for something. What are they trying to achieve? What does the soul want in that symptom? And I'm saying that in that defense is what the soul wants. I'll tell you, this brings up another topic similar, but a book that influenced me a lot was a book by the psychiatrist Robert Stein. I think it was called Coupling and Uncoupling. Maybe that was not a book, but just an essay he wrote. Coupling and uncoupling. His idea is that all of us, or maybe many of us, when we are in a relationship, we have this great desire to be a couple with this person. But eventually we may discover that we also have a great desire not to couple. And how do you get those two together? How do you do both at the same time? Well, without literalizing it and, having an open marriage or things like that. But it seems to me that just acknowledging this fantasy, this desire, that your soul wants separateness. The more you go into these symptoms, instead of trying to get rid of them, the more you go into them, you discover that they transform even as you think about them. They become less objectionable, and they take on more meaning. They're more convincing that this is something okay. So that's the thing. Can I find a way to be connected and not lose myself at the same time? Get into that fusion state that Hillman complained about.
Right. And sometimes two souls are, their paths aren't going to meet. If a behavior continues to happen that's unacceptable to another person, there is a line that people need to have, and that comes back to the boundary thing, that
yes.
Sometimes it has to be recognized that, maybe that this is not a relationship that should continue.
Yes, that's why I wrote that chapter in Soulmates on endings. And I just got an email from someone I don't know the other day. Soulmates came out, 20 years ago, and I don't remember what's in it too much. And this person sent me an email the other day and said, I picked up your book Soulmates the other day, and it's worth it for me for the chapter on endings. And I'm not surprised because, like what you're saying there, that a lot of people feel that you can't make an ending without tons of guilt, and that relationships should always succeed and last forever. It's beautiful when they do, but for most of us, it seems there are endings, and they're very painful, and they stay with us forever. But it takes some courage to face up and see what your soul, always to ask what your soul wants, and it may not want that relationship.
Right. And like you said before, what the soul really needs, that relationship seemed to give that person that's now missing.
Yes.
Because it could be through death. Eventually
Definitely.
That's the ending for all of us. So.
Well, yes, absolutely. There are all kinds of endings.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to be able to take those endings and hold them and live with them, and not pretend that life has absolute endings. Yes, you don't live with another person again. You don't see them maybe, but still in your dreams and in your emotions, there's still the reliving of all of that.
That's true. It's an extraordinary point on relationships. And so to kind of shift the discussion a little, to get into the digital age, you comment a bit on that in your work. And our digital communication age is one where I feel we've really lost connection. I actually have a short ebook out about this because it's just such a problem now in our society. It has its benefits, but it also has the disconnect part of it.
Yeah.
And you discussed that we're suffering a loss of soul due to the electronic age. I think you even did that in your books that are 20 years old. So you were ahead of the times there.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the virtues of the soul, and how do telecommunications kind of take away from this? And lastly, what can we do to remedy this?
Well, I guess I assume that what you're talking about there is that it's a very soulful thing to meet up with friends and go to a restaurant and sit around for hours talking and close the joint,
Yeah.
close it down. So that kind of thing is you can't measure the value of it, how it helps glue people together and in a good way and create a sense of conviviality which wakes up the soul. Conviviality is a very important virtue of the soul. A need. Conviviality meaning enjoying being with other people. And that can be very intimate with friends or with your lover, or it could be a broader thing. I think you can also be convivial with people you've never met before. So that's an important virtue of the soul, and it's one that's difficult to feel probably with electronic media. Now, you feel it to some extent. I think I enjoy communicating with by email a lot. There are a lot of limitations to it, but there are also some benefits. As you were saying, there are benefits to the technology, but the drawbacks are there, and I think the loss of conviviality is part of it. And another thing, too, is that the soul is vitality. It's being alive, having a body that's alive and an imagination. And that is really, really important to us. And when you bring a lot of technology into your life, you begin to feel that you're a machine. And if there's anything, I think, that is terribly, terribly wrong with people today, it's that they are being, their souls are being sucked away by, not just by the machinery around us, but by the way our experts, even our psychological experts and our medical experts, talk to us. They talk to us as if we were objects and that we were machines.
Right.
And like people ask me, if they say, oh, you must be wired to be a writer. And I say, that metaphor doesn't work for me. I reject it. I'm not wired for anything.
Exactly.
That's not what I want to be, wired.
No.
And the trouble, I'm very serious about that, because all of our literature, even our psychological literature, treats people as though now, especially today, that the brain explains everything.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the greatest threats to the soul these days is pleasure and finding answers in studies of the brain. That can be a very elusive and difficult thing to see. It's difficult to see how that kind of talk takes the soul out of us, so that we describe our experience not with the depth of our emotion and the stories of our lives. Rather, we try to look for some brain activity, what part of the brain lights up, and we feel so great because it's such a simple explanation.
Yeah.
So that's where the soul is being lost, I think. And the technology is part of that whole world. It's not the machinery itself that is bad. I think computers can be full of, they can give a lot of soul to people's lives, depending on how you use them. I used to complain, too, by the way, I don't know if it's still true, that of course, people don't read magazines now, but when I was first writing my books, I was complaining that the magazines about computers never talked about the human experience or the soul of a computer or the soul that you find in a computer. That's very rare as far as I can see, that kind of talk.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what we need, is to see that technology, our technology, I think, could be part of our soul life. But not if we give it everything and say that technological talk is adequate to explaining who we are as people.
Right. So we have to bring our soul into the process
Yes.
rather than selling our soul, dare I
Yes,
say.
yes, exactly. Put that on a bumper sticker. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's pretty frightening, but I think you make a really good point too about seeing, obviously there's tons of benefits and to technology and computers, and email can be a real contemplative way of conversing because you have time to think and you have distance to be with your ideas and other people's ideas first. I think there's also a lot of liquid courage that goes on, and a lot of room left to read into things when people get emotional through, say, texting and things like that. That's when it can get dangerous, right?
Right.
Thanks for your commentary on that. So another question, then we'll get into some of your latest works. So we all want answers. We want to know who we are, and I think the ultimate fear is that if you let go, you run the risk of being nowhere and not recognizing your own life purpose. And I think that fear is often behind people wanting to define and control things so much, is the fear of the uncertainty. So what's the satisfaction that we get by being more open-ended, even when things seem really uncertain?
Well, I guess the obvious benefit is that being open and uncertain, being an uncertainty, it is an openness. It's allowing life to happen, and that's the whole point about a soulful life, is that you're not in control, that you realize there are things that are inside you, desires and fears you hardly even understand. And the world itself is inviting you almost every day to new experiences, and you don't know whether you should follow them or not. You don't know if that's your way or not. And so there's uncertainty all around us. But remember John Keats, this young poet, and he died when he was 26. He wrote this letter to his brother where he talked about negative capability. And there he specifically says, remember, negative capability. So it's an ability, a capacity to live with uncertainty. That was one of the things that he put in a list of negative capability, living in uncertainty or with uncertainties. So I think that to be able to live with uncertainties, it's the human condition anyway, and it's not having to live such a controlling life is allows life to happen. That's what soul is all about, letting life happen. And it happens to you, whatever you is. I'm not sure what I and you are all about. But life happens. And maybe our job is nothing more than to be the setting in which life happens in our own way, in our biography and who we are. Life is happening through us. And that is full of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to come next. Now, that can be translated into very specific moments in a person's life where they don't know what's going to come next. Now, when I left the monastery, I had no idea what would happen next. I had no idea whatsoever. I was not leaving for anything, to do anything or to be with anybody or anything like that. There was nothing on the other side of it. And that uncertainty was really, it was painful, I suppose, or difficult, challenging in some ways. But as I think back on it, it was one of the most vital and alive times in my life. And I feel that sometimes then these uncertainties boil down to the actual moment of when you're not certain about what to do next. That can be a very important moment. And you have to be open to experiment and to looking around and not judging too quickly, and certainly not saying no too quickly.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that's very inspiring, the way you put it. So many people get jaded from their experiences, their negative experiences, and it's so important to, what did you call it earlier about resisting the conditioning and stay open to all these uncertainties, because the magic also lies within that, the mystery, as you call it,
That's right.
It's very exciting.
Yes, but some of our psychology teaches we should have a stronger ego and be in charge. And I remember certain people that I worked with who were quite unstable in their lives, and their psychiatrists or psychologists were trying to get them to have a much stronger ego. And I felt I wanted to go with the symptom. I thought maybe what their problem was they had such a tough ego and so much control. And what they were looking for was the freedom to be uncertain.
Right. So it's almost a softening of who they are that has to happen to let other things in.
Exactly.
Well, I'm on a very soulful journey myself. I always have been, and it's great to hear all this. This path is so individual, and sometimes it's even isolating, regardless of your status in the world. And I find your work to really serve as a real confirmation of what we go through, and it can at times even take the sting out of sort of that isolating experience by reminding us of the sacredness and to not get too discouraged or too jaded along the way. And, because there's so many stereotypes and cultural pressures and ideas out there of what everyone should be like. So I really appreciate hearing from you about all this. I want to also discuss a little bit about your current work, your recent translation of the Gospels, and your revolutionary new book, Gospel, the Book of Matthew, a new approach to theology for everyone. And then we can also discuss your aging book that you have coming out.
Of course, now, we talked about this. I was in a monastery years ago. I studied Latin, but also Greek. So I had 3 or 4 years of Greek, and I used to read, when I was 19 years old, I used to read the Gospels in Greek, my own choice, every morning. We had a 15-minute time in our schedule for what we called spiritual reading. I remember one year when I spent the year reading the Gospels in Greek, because I found that an interesting thing. I liked the idea of having that original language. It's not terribly difficult if once you learn a little Greek. It's not like modern Greek or even Homer or anything like that, which is very complicated. It's a kind of a spoken, easygoing, so it's not that big a deal. However, I felt that there are a lot of basic Greek terms that I sensed were mistranslated and could be translated differently if you had a different outlook. So part of translating the Gospels was not to say that I could do a better job of that I knew more about the Gospels. I don't. There are experts all over the place who know infinitely more than I do. But there were a few key words I thought I knew from my studies in Greek mythology and tragedy meant something different from what I always hear, like the word sin. Sin is such an awful word, I think, talk about judgmental. And when if you read Aristotle, you find out that he explored the Greek word that they translate as sin, and he called it tragic ignorance, which I think is a much better way of looking at it. So in my translations, I might have to use 3 or 4 words for it, because you can't just substitute one word for another always. So when I come to the word hamartia, which is usually translated sin, I will say that maybe Jesus was able to forgive a person's ignorance, not knowing what life was about that turned out so tragically. Something like that. I think Aristotle's in my mind. He's behind me. That's where I get that. So if you multiply that like over 25 or 30 or 40 key words in the Gospels, you get a different tone then. The tone, you get rid of sin and you've already got a different tone, but do that with a bunch of other words and you have a different sense of what the Gospels are about. So that's what I did, and then so as the book came out, I like it very much. The Gospel is translated and on the one side of the page when you open the book, and on the other page is a commentary from me about various passages.
That sounds fantastic. And
well, what's interesting? I really wanted to translate the Gospel so that anybody could get something from it.
Right.
Whether you're Buddhist or atheist or whatever. You could read because we go to, I go to the Tao Te Ching all the time, or the Heart Sutra. Why shouldn't anybody go to the Gospels in the same way? For spiritual wisdom, inspiration, and education. So that's what I've done, and I've been so happy to get responses from people who told me that they've never been interested in the Gospels, but they were so touched by these or excited by them. That really makes me feel good.
That's really fantastic. So you don't have to be a Christian to pick this up.
No,
you can be anybody.
Yeah.
And that's part of the whole
You can be
point.
a Christian because, you know, that's the tradition, and I certainly honor that, respect it tremendously, but no, it's bigger than that.
Yeah, it's accessible for everyone. And I think this is highly needed in our culture right now, where
that's right.
we often resist. Those who aren't Christian can sometimes resist Christianity because of people who've maybe given it a bad rap or whatever, and you're going deeper into it and showing what these things really mean and how they apply to just anyone.
That's right.
Yeah, I love it. And then your aging book. You have a new book on aging with a fresh take on a theme that applies to young people.
Well, I'm looking at aging across the lifespan to some extent. I mean, I am writing this for people who are concerned about getting older. That's who I'm really writing to. Now, the majority of people I talk to myself are between 45 and 70.
That's young.
Over 70 people don't seem to be quite as worried about what that is. And that's me. I'm in that category.
Mm-hmm.
And before that, though, I think people begin to feel they have these, what I call in this book, a first taste of aging. Like you may see a wrinkle or you may see a gray hair. You might do that when you're in your teens. Mm-hmm. I tell a story about an aunt of mine who was crying one day because she was turning 16 and she felt she was getting old, too old.
Oh, no.
I mean, you know, but it's relative. And so I think anybody could read this book on aging, no matter what age you are. But in fact, I think it'll be, you know, probably of most urgent use for people who are in their mid-40s to maybe mid-60s or beyond a little bit, to figure out how to deal with these changes. You know, when you see people losing their capacity, getting sick, getting diseases, and hobbling around, not able to do the things they used to do, and losing their memory, and you know, it's frightening, and it's pretty hard to see anything good about aging. But so I try to be very clear and straightforward and honest about these problems, but at the same time try to offer a way. What I do, of course, talk about the soul, and the soul doesn't age the same way. I think there is an aging aspect to the soul. I think when people say, I am 40, but I feel like I'm 20, or I'm 60 and feel like I'm 40, I think what they're really saying is that my soul is 40.
Mm-hmm.
And because the soul doesn't age in the same calendar, the same way, same sense of time. And so I want to write about the soul's age a great deal in this book. In an inner way, who are we? And then when you get to be an actual older person, you don't identify with that outer aging.
Right.
And you don't deny it, but you don't identify. There's much more going on. And I find in my clients, I have some elderly clients, and when you have that approach, they're finding new life and vitality in their 80s.
That's really inspiring.
Yeah.
That sounds like a powerful new book. And when does it come out?
I just got the contract for it 3 or 4 days ago. I think it will come out not until sometime in 2017. I'm not sure just when. Maybe mid-year or maybe even the fall. I'm not sure.
Great.
It's a ways off. That's the way publishing works.
Mm-hmm.
I will get my part done quickly, but then publishers are very cautious and careful, and I like that, that I hand it over to somebody and they're very thoughtful about what to do with it.
That's great. Do you have any other things you'd like to tell the audience?
Just one thing. There's one book of mine that we haven't touched. There's several, of course. But another time we should talk about the soul of sex.
Yes.
That's one of my books.
Ah.
And I do the same thing for sexuality that I'm doing for aging. I talk about the soul's sexuality. and because it's such an important thing, and it comes up in therapy so much. I think it's very important that people find a way to deal with their sexuality that's full of soul. If they don't, they're going to feel very confused and driven and full of regrets and all kinds of bad things. So that's for another time.
Well, that's remarkable. Wonderful. So your website for people?
My website is thomasmoresoul.com. And there you can find information about me and events where I'll be going. I travel around quite a bit. And then I do a tweet every morning, which you can find on Twitter.
I love those.
And they go onto Facebook.
Uh-huh.
That's a little practice of my own I do every day. And the other thing is, recently I haven't written for Resurgence in quite a while, but I still write for Huffington Post, and I also write now a new job. I write for Patheos.com. That's Patheos. It's a website for people writing about spiritual matters. And I have a blog there called Soul and Spirit. And so I don't have a active blog on my website, but the Patheos blog is where you can find more recent thoughts and commentaries on what's going on.
That's magnificent. Thank you. And thank you so much for being here, Tom. Your work and your wisdom is invaluable. And I really, as I said before, really thank you for encouraging us to be true individuals and for being a truly soulful human being who's not afraid of the magic of life.
Well, thank you very much. And I have to say, too, that conversation's a two-way street, and you are remarkable at being in conversation about things that have weight. It's wonderful.
Oh, thank you. I have been all my life, so I've had a little bit of practice.
Oh, good. I'm not surprised.
Yeah, I'm one of those natural seekers. I kind of can't help it.
Good.
But I appreciate you saying that. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Tom.
You do a great job. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Okay,
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Inspire Me Show with hostess Layla Ashley, hypnotherapist, life coach, author, and speaker. Find out more about Layla's services and products at laylaashley.com. The Inspire Me Show is dedicated to bringing passion and inspiration into your life and your relationships. Join Layla on her next episode of this regular program here on KPFK. Until then, live in the spirit of inspiration.